Hello, welcome to Cat 109, the history of politics and ethics of cannabis. Today we're going to be talking about culture and specifically the culture of cannabis. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, so to speak, we're going to define what culture actually is. Culture is a complex system of meaning and behavior that defines the way of life for a given group or society. It gives people a sense of belonging, tells them how to behave, and how to handle certain situations. So, for example, and on the right you'll see a little graphic with various cultural aspects from religion, medical, cures, manners, clothing and dress, how our work schedules reflect us, food, probably the most cultural aspect of all. The idea of culture is that it is something that inherently is taught as you're a child, and it becomes a way of thinking that you believe is normal. So when we think of culture, we think of abstract ideas, things that cannot be easily defined. So, the opposite of abstract would be concrete, and concrete means that I am 5'7" tall. I have, brown eyes. Those are the kinds of things that we can say without a doubt are very concrete. The more abstract things include our beliefs, our knowledge, morals, our customs, our language, our ways of thinking, how people interact with one another, values, art, laws, habits, dress, patterns of behavior. And again, you may think about your parents or your grandparents and say, geez, why do they act that way? Or why do they say that kind of stuff? Well, for them, at a certain point in their history, that was a normalized habit, behavior, experience. And you have to understand, everybody evolves through culture. So, give your grandma a little break when she starts saying her stuff because, it's just the way culture evolves. Or she's just mean. So, also how we dress, our patterns of behavior, music, how we define beautiful, how we define ugly, how we define good, how we define bad, how we define right, and how we define wrong. So in one country, a woman who is driving a vehicle is completely normal and there's nothing wrong about it. In another country, a woman may be prevented from driving vehicles of any kind. So again, your culture defines normal for a lot of people. So let's talk about the characteristics of a culture. Culture is shared. There are certain symbols, language patterns, belief systems, and ways of thinking that are distinctly unique but shared within this group. So, if somebody says to you, "Hey, are you celebrating 420?" Everybody who is involved in cannabis, for the most part, understands what that reference means. Additionally, culture is learned. Some culture is learned directly. So when our parents teach us how to use silverware or how to use chopsticks, and some culture is learned indirectly through observation and imitation. So, the first time you were in an environment where cannabis was available, maybe you watched someone roll a joint, pack a bong, put it in a vape cartridge, whatever. But the point is that you were watching and you were paying attention. And at some point, maybe somebody even showed you, or the ever famous using the YouTube video to learn how to do something. So, culturally, we have this shared sense of what binds us together. As I've mentioned, culture is taken for granted. This is normal. We don't think about their uniqueness. It's, for example, you're at a party, someone's sharing a joint. It's a social experience. Culture is also symbolic. Meaning is not inherent in the symbol itself, but the meaning is defined by the people who give it meaning. So if you think about the United States flag, that's patriotism, liberty, freedom, independence, George Washington, all of that patriotic stuff. The Confederate flag, a symbol of oppression, a symbol of an ancient way of life that, deemed certain people inferior. So it has a very negative connotation. The aforementioned 420, that is a symbol that, literally means a certain time of day, but because of its association with marijuana, most of us who hear that understand that there's usually a relationship. Although many times, at least twice a day, there is no relationship. Culture varies across time and place. Culture develops as people adapt to their environment. Your era also has specific culture. People who were teenagers during the 80s and the 90s had much different cultural experiences than the folks who were teenagers now or who were teenagers 10 years ago. So starting at the left, kind of some representations, we have our 1950s and early 60s where, it was about trying to join the mainstream. Then the 70s, and I know this show is not from the 1970s, but it does have one of the greatest basement circles of all time, the 70s show. 1980s, Jeff Spicoli from Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Of course, we got Snoop in the 90s, and then look, today we have the folks who were teenagers in the 50s and 60s now using medical cannabis for their aches and pains. So in a sense, we've almost come full circle, but keeping in mind that, your cultural experience is really going to be based in large part on your age as much as anything else, because every era is different. And then, kind of going back to the idea of beliefs, and these are the shared ideas collectively held by a given culture about what is true. So you could argue there's no objective truth. All truth is subjective. It's all in the eye of the beholder. So what we have to accept then is that shared beliefs bind people together in society. And beliefs are the basis for norms, and those norms are what becomes normal. So if you look over at the chart on the right, what you're going to see here is how many people back the legalization of medical marijuana, and it's divided up by political belief and by age. The red is the people who are against it, and you notice across the board it's pretty low. And, the point is that you can look at a lot of different demographics, age, education, political group, race, and what you see is the system of beliefs that a particular culture holds. So in some ways, whatever the topic is that you're discussing is going to define the culture in some ways, because that is part of their belief system. So the dominant culture is the culture of the most powerful group in a society. It is the standard by which other cultures are judged. So, we have to kind of look at the United States and understand that the dominant culture is white. It is Anglo-Saxon, meaning Northern European. It is Protestant for the most part, because people from Northern Europe are generally Protestant. And generally, the people in power are men. So unless you're if you can check all those boxes, you're probably not part of the dominant culture. A lot of us have our own subcultures. Some of us are Irish and we celebrate every meal with a potato. I'm kidding, and yet I'm not. On the other hand, you have Mexican families, you have Russian families, you have families that, their families have been in this country for hundreds of years, but, as African Americans, they may feel disenfranchised. Native Americans, they showed up 10,000 years ago, and we still managed to subvert them. So these subcultures are groups that, share many of the values and behaviors of the dominant culture, but they also have attributes that make them stand apart from the dominant culture. So if the dominant culture disapproves of the subculture, they will identify them as outlaws or criminals. So if you think about what's going on today with immigration, we have a president who has literally said that immigrants coming from other countries are criminals, where the truth is they're often people who are escaping, civil war, violence, and climate issues. People are getting, their villages are being wiped out because of climate. So it's how we name things that really define for a person whether they are part of a accepted subculture or an outlaw subculture. Culture changes in response to changed conditions in society. So the baby boom generation, born between 1945 and 1962, is not only a huge segment of the population. So we're talking 76 million out of approximately 330 million in the U.S. right about now. So almost one in five, 20%ish. But they're also getting older and are interested in using medical cannabis for their aches and pains. And it's one of the largest growing populations of cannabis users, because these folks did smoke marijuana back in the 60s. And, when they joined society and became, parents and grandparents, they had to change their behaviors. But now that it's becoming not just socially acceptable, but pretty much elemental to how people are coping with their pain these days, now it's the norm. Cultures change through cultural diffusion, which is the transmission of cultural elements from one society or cultural group to another. So, in a sense, you can think about the crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s. It is commonly understood that the crack epidemic got so bad so fast because the American government, the CIA, was supporting an illegal war in South America, and they were using sales of crack to finance it. So the African American culture, which had embraced crack, and there's a picture of Whitney Houston when she was saying crack is whack, said, you know what, the government is trying to kill us again, we're going to go to a different substance. And at that point, you saw the African American community really turn and start looking at marijuana as a much safer alternative, to have a little fun, to relax. Cultures change as a result of innovation, including inventions and technological developments. So, one thing that's really changing now is you have technology being developed for the cannabis industry. So you're seeing better cannabis. The cannabinoids are more targeted. You have better sales data, so patients can get better information about the types of strains that will help them. In addition, we have biosynthesis techniques which allow for extractions that are cannabinoid specific, providing sellers with more specific options for specific disorders. And then, finally, we also look at cultural change as being imposed. As more and more people are trying medical cannabis now, they see that it is okay and it's now something that they can do. But I want you to go back 20 years ago when California was suggesting using medical marijuana. So, it was very controversial, and California was the first state, and when they legalized it, it really changed a lot of people's perspectives, because now they're is a preponderance of people out there who believe that it will not hurt you. And for some people, they need that cultural recognition of it being legal. So, moving on, we have the culture of language. And this is a very important element. And we're going to talk about it in more detail beyond just this slide, because there's some really interesting ideas behind language. So, language evolves over time with specific terms used by specific groups. Every generation has its own slang. Groovy man. Each profession has its own terminology. Lawyers, doctors, IT professionals, and social groups have their own language. Sports, religion. Cannabis users have also developed a language that has evolved over time. So in the 1940s, and this is a list that was compiled and published in Time magazine. These are some of the common uses of common terms for cannabis in the 1940s. And remember, this is the first half of the 40s. We had World War II. Second half of the 40s, we had everybody came home from the war and were really just starting life all over again. So we had giggle smokes, goof butts, Mary Warner, Mary Jane, loco weed, bambalaka, which is my favorite, balaka, muka, blue sage, grass, mohaski, muggles, and Indian hay. Makes me wonder if J.K. Rowling knew what she was talking about. So the term marijuana is believed to have come from the Mexican word marihuano, which means intoxicant. And I do apologize for my terrible Hispanic or Spanish pronunciation. Other sources point to the fact that ren, roughly means hemp seed flowers in Chinese, and Mexicans possibly adopted the term as marijuana in Spanish. In the 1800s, and this is just to keep in mind that there is some Chinese-Mexican overlap, many Chinese immigrants came through Mexico on their way to help build the railroad in the United States. Cannabis history expert Dr. Barney Wharf, a professor at the University of Kansas, thinks that it's a version of the Spanish names Maria and Juana, which are very common names in much of Latin America. It was probably a slang term that was used somewhere in Latin America and then eventually became popularized. So this is what we call etymology. Where did this word come from? Where was it first used? Let's try and, get to the root, so to speak. However, what we also do when we look at language is we look at who owns the word and who applies the word. So, in the 1920s, we have our Mexican immigrants. They're the ones who initially brought marijuana to the West Coast for recreational purposes. They introduced the term grifo, which is a Mexican slang word to describe someone under the influence of marijuana, because grifo can refer to tangled frizzy hair or a similar mental state, kind of like loco. That became grifo, which then became abbreviated to reefer. So if you ever wondered where that word came from. In the 1920s, a common term referring to marijuana began to be used. 1920s. Okay, so 100 years ago, weed became something that people started to use as a term, a reference. This term, still in use today, etymologists believe that the term was popularized because marijuana was often found growing wild in certain climates, especially California. Here's a nice little pulp fiction novel, The Devil's Harvest. A good girl until she lights a reefer. Dun dun dun. The truth about marijuana, the smoke of hell. So, yeah, we constantly are reflecting on the fact that marijuana has been popular for a really long time, and the government has kind of gone to that extreme sense of we're going to go over the top, which just makes it even less believable that anything wrong. So, language. We're going to talk about how language is used by people who want to subvert or make users feel inferior. As Mexicans came to the U.S. to escape the violence of the Mexican Revolution during the early 1900s, anti-immigrant sentiments amongst politicians were growing. Marijuana prohibitionists like Harry Anslinger, a former alcohol prohibitionist, if you got to get rid of the booze, then you're going to get rid of the weed, who ran the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 to 1962, started to use the term marijuana instead of cannabis while spouting outrageous claims about this new public menace. So, think about the word marijuana. Does it sound foreign? Yes. Cannabis, on the other hand, sounds Latin, or more importantly, it sounds like science. The commonly accepted theory is that Anslinger utilized the term marijuana to make this plant sound foreign, stoke already simmering anti-Mexican racism, and avoid any associations with the word cannabis. Because science. We don't want people to remember that marijuana is a plant. This quote deserves its own slide. Anslinger declared, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing results from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others." So that really does get the award for the most racist statement by a public official in the 20th century. It's hard to get much worse than that. But it's again, we're using language to twist what people believe. And in the same way, when we use the word cannabis, we're reclaiming, in certain ways, the science behind it. So let's talk about slang in the 20th century, more recent. So various slang terms for marijuana emerged, but most widely used term from the 30s through the 80s was the word pot. Researchers believe that pot came from the Spanish word poetagaya, which is a contraction of the name for an alcoholic drink created by soaking weed leaves in wine or brandy. And I'm not going to kill that word either. In the 1950s and 60s, hippies traveled to Iran, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Afghanistan and brought back seed from the Hindu Kush plants that grew in the disputed region of the same name, hence the name Kush. So, again, the slang that you've been using, it does come from somewhere, and it's usually pretty interesting where it comes from. Chronic was first used by Snoop Dogg. Yo! It spread through pop culture and was used by Dr. Dre as a name for one of his albums. And there they are, the gentleman over there on the right. According to Snoop, he misheard someone talking about growing cannabis at a party. They said they grew the weed using hydroponics, and Snoop thought that person said hydrochronic. He liked the sound of the word and shortened it to chronic. So, it's one of these stories that's just super cool. So, can't talk about cannabis culture without talking about the term 420. It originated in the 1970s, and there's all kinds of stories. I mean, if you go on Wikipedia, they have all kinds of stories. But if you do the real research, what you're going to find out is that in 1991, High Times magazine published a story which recounts how 5 high school students in 1971 in San Rafael, California, found out that a Coast Guard service member who could no longer tend his plot of marijuana plants near the Point Reyes Peninsula Coast Guard Station was basically abandoning his farm. So, with a map of the area in hand, the students, who had christened themselves the Waldos, because apparently they liked leaning against the walls, decided to find some of this free weed. Great plan. except they were all athletes, so they had to stay after school for practice. So they would meet up outside their school at 4:20 every afternoon when practice was over to hunt for this free weed. And despite weeks and weeks of looking for it, they never did find it. But they now had an awesome code word that became a worldwide reference. So how did that happen? The Grateful Dead, and if you don't know who the Grateful Dead are, you really should go look and see who they were. They're a jam band of great renown. And they're really the people who kind of invented the idea of arriving first thing in the morning to hang out and party all day before the concert to a certain extent, or they at least turned it into a lifestyle. So one of the students from the Waldos had an older brother who was friends with a member of the Grateful Dead. And this led to introductions and jobs as roadies for some of the Waldos. As the Waldos became part of life on the road, the term began to spread to band members, and by the 1980s, the magazine High Times had begun writing about it and using it in their marketing. So, it's not the end of the world story, but it's also not Hitler's Day, which I always thought was stupid, but that's just me. But, it does make sense that a group of high school kids would have come up with a term that became internationally known. So let's talk about some of the slang from today, and hopefully you know all this, or if you don't, welcome to some new slang. We got some alfalfa, asparagus, bud, 13, herb, green. There's all kinds of things. If marijuana is really good, it's called dank. If it's really bad, we call it cabbage, Nixon, or catnip. If you hold on to a joint for too long, it is known as bogarting. And this is named after legendary actor Humphrey Bogart, and that's the handsome gentleman on the right-hand side in the black and white picture, who was famed for keeping a cigarette dangling on the end of his lips as he spoke. And if you watch any of his movies, I highly recommend Casablanca, for example, you will see that that cigarette is always there. The end of a joint is known as a roach. This first time this was appeared in writing was in 1938, comparing the butt of a joint to the appearance of this insect. And over there on the right, you'll see a cute cockroach and a marijuana roach. Didn't want to give you a gross, ugly-looking cockroach because they're kind of gross. The use of slurs, and this is where we're getting into derogatory slang and the way that language defines what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So the use of slurs, and in the old days, Asians were often called Orientals, Indians were called Injuns or rednecks. Rednecks were people who worked the farms because their necks were always red, and it was a slur against Irish to begin with, and then expanded out to just Southerners in general. It reinforces the social patterns of inequality, especially when used in a casual way. It also emphasizes the power relationships depending on who gets to name who and what they get to name them. Some groups have reclaimed these derogatory names in an effort to take the power out of them. So when African Americans call each other the N-word, or gay people use derogatory words to call each other names, it's reclaiming the power. So when a gay guy calls his friend "Oh Mary," he's not questioning his masculinity. He is questioning the behavior that he sees as whiny, and it's funny for them. Ultimately, it helps build that cohesiveness and solidarity within these groups. So if you're an out group, if you're a group that's not part of the mainstream, having your own language and reclaiming the language that's used against you is a way of building your own sense of power. So we have all heard negative cannabis slang. Pothead, stoner, druggie, burnout, airhead, hippie, damn dirty hippie, bong rat, and I love bong rat. And it's like the pizza rat. You see this little rat running around the bong. And then dopehead. These words are used to imply that cannabis users are losers and dumb. The use of these words is meant to diminish an entire cultural movement. So, when somebody says, "Oh, he's just a stoner," well, how do you know that? Some of the dumbest people I've ever met never touched marijuana. So over here on the right, and I'm going to make my own statements, but I also try and provide you some reasonable data, valid data that supports our perspective. And this shows that most smokers of marijuana have some college or a degree. So, it's not like it's something that people don't do who are really, really smart. And finally, my personal favorite anti-marijuana politician, that's easy for me to say, former Attorney General for the U.S., Jeff Sessions, has made the following statements about marijuana. First, I thought those guys, and he was talking about the Ku Klux Klan, were okay until I learned they smoke pot, because that's what makes you a bad person. I mean, we need grown-ups in charge in Washington to say marijuana is not the kind of thing that ought to be legalized. It ought not to be minimized. That it's in fact a very real danger. Lives will be impacted, families will be broken up, children will be damaged because of the difficulties their parents have, and people may be psychologically impacted the rest of their lives with marijuana. Now, if that is the logic he is looking at, he only has to look at the local liquor store. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot more kids who grew up in alcoholic homes where violence and rage were par for the course than you're going to see in a house where a parent is using cannabis. Here are some of our works cited, the main important ones. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me. If you are not in my class but you do have a question, please leave a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much and have a great day.